People have been predicting the demise of the housing market since like 2015, 2016, and there's been talk of a crash ever since then. Every year, prices rise, and every year those voices get louder and louder and louder. Some really smart people are saying this, and some arguably not so smart people. But I think that the moment is finally here. The housing crisis is about to hit the United States like a tsunami. It's going to blindside everybody because it's not going to look how most people think it will. Here's why. The people who have been predicting the crash of the housing market, they're right. Chaos is coming. But they're wrong in how they've laid out how it's actually going to happen and what it's going to look like. So in order to understand where we are, we need to take a quick back step to 2008 and look at exactly what caused the housing market to collapse back then, because that ties directly into what's happening right now. Back in the day, in the mid-2000s, financial institutions were cashing in on a red-hot real estate market by lending to pretty much anybody who had a pulse. Borrowers were piling into the market, purchasing multiple homes entirely on credit. Massive amounts of subprime loans were issued to people who had no business taking out a loan to purchase a home. It became so commonplace for people who should not have been loaned money to purchase a house that there became a nickname assigned to this type of loan, a ninja loan, being issued to somebody with no income, no job, or assets. Ninja. And if that was you, if you didn't have a job, if you didn't have any income, if you didn't have any assets, you could still get a home, unlike millennials today that have a lot of those things in place and they still can't qualify. Back then, it was a completely different environment. The whole system was plagued by over-leveraged buyers, scooping up homes with little or no money down, and no income to support the purchase of these homes. And you might ask yourself, well, why were people buying these homes if they didn't have the money? The reason is much like today, the market was red hot. Prices kept going up and up and up. And it was so easy to come across money to borrow that you could just buy a home even though you didn't have money or income or assets or whatever. And if you waited 2 or 3 years, the idea was that you'd be able to sell that house or the 3 houses that you bought even though you didn't really have the money, and you can make a profit on it.
It's free real estate.
Because financial institutions also started deferring payments. So the way that they would structure the loan is for the first 2 or 3 years, you got what was called a teaser rate. So when you bought your home, you only had to pay interest on the loan for the first 2 or 3 years. And after 3 years, then you'd start paying the principal down as well. And so the cost of your mortgage would go up. But presumably by then, based on how prices were going up, you'd be able to sell that house at a 10 or 20% increase in value and cash out. Everybody had the same plan until things started to fall apart. See, the collapse happened because everybody was playing the same game of musical chairs. Financial institutions were doing this in issuing this bad credit, and consumers and real estate investors were doing this by taking the bad credit and leveraging to the point where they didn't have the money to be able to pay their mortgages and service the interest plus principal after the teaser rates ended. And when the teaser rates finally started to end for everybody in bulk, people started to sell real estate because they couldn't afford to pay the principal on top of the teaser rate that they were used to for the past 2 to 3 years. Now, while all of this was going on Main Street with real estate investors and people purchasing their first homes, financial institutions were taking that debt that they had issued, these ninja loans, and they packaged them up into mortgage-backed securities and sold them to each other all over the world. Banks owned these assets that were rated at a really high rating, AAA. So I won't get too into depth with how this worked, but what they would do is they would take these bad loans and they would package them with better loans and better loans on top of it. They'd make these tranches is what they were called. And so you'd have essentially this cake of debt where on the very top, everything looked really nice, really delicious. But deep down in the core of this cake were all of these bad ticking time bombs of mortgages that people were eventually going to default on. And these cakes, these mortgage-backed securities, we'll call them cakes because it's better to visualize like something that looks great on the outside, but at the inside is just rotten to its core. Financial institutions like Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns, Morgan Stanley, Chase, Wells Fargo, pretty much every major bank that you can think of was participating in this. And they were selling these to each other as financial investments. People were getting invested into these securities and their pensions and their retirements. Pretty much every financial instrument in the world was tied to these things somehow. So when people realized that they couldn't make their payments and they started selling their real estate, It triggered 3 simultaneous market sell-offs at a speed and magnitude that people really had never seen before. First, you had real estate investors that had all of these homes that they couldn't pay for, that needed to sell them because they couldn't service the interest plus principal after their teaser rate ended. Then you had the financial institutions that had packaged these bad mortgage-backed securities into these investment products and sold them to each other. And all of a sudden, all of them simultaneously woke up and realized that these assets that they'd paid for, that they had been trading, were essentially worthless because the underlying debt couldn't be paid back by investors and homeowners who had borrowed money they couldn't afford. So almost overnight, real estate investments and firms across the country went bankrupt. Individual people and families lost their jobs and their homes. Financial institutions dumped mortgage-backed securities like it was their only pleasure in life, which not only crashed the real estate market, but it crashed the stock market. And all of this affected the home builders as well, who had been building bigger homes faster than ever, cashing in on a red-hot real estate market. And overnight, in the matter of just a couple of months, all of it ended. It all went away. Entire corporations and businesses went under. Others were bailed out by the government. And this is where the Federal Reserve stepped in, which set the stage for where we're at now in the housing crisis of 2022. You see, with all this financial chaos, the Federal Reserve decided to step in and save the day by buying these mortgage-backed securities. So again, this is kind of confusing if you haven't been following it, but the Fed essentially lowered interest rates by printing money, which they used to buy mortgage-backed securities to help support the banks, to get more money into the economy, to keep interest rates low so that people could afford to buy housing again because nobody was buying, nobody was building, and the world was about to end. And we've been doing that. The Fed has been printing money and buying mortgage-backed securities and keeping interest rates artificially low ever since. It hasn't really stopped. And this is what brings us to the housing crisis, the housing crash, if you will, of 2022, because it's tied directly to what happened in 2008. The Fed's printing of money and keeping interest rates low has in a way made housing more affordable. At least it did from the time between 2010 to 2016 until prices started to rise again. Those low interest rates made it easier for people to borrow money and purchase more home. So people started doing that. But more easily accessible money at lower interest rates means more dollars chasing a fixed number of goods, a fixed number of homes. And so prices have steadily been rising. That's one of the factors in the higher home prices that we've seen lately. And these rising prices due to low interest rates has caused a lot of people to start looking for signs of collapse, cracks within the structure. Because what we're experiencing right now certainly feels a lot like 2008. The real estate market is red hot, but the problem is history doesn't usually repeat itself. It usually rhymes, which is why so few people recognize the crisis and the collapse that we're about to experience for what it actually is. The crash in 2022 isn't going to be a crash in home prices. It's going to be a collapse of affordability for middle-class Americans, because home prices are just going to continue to go up. We're not going to see a collapse in home values. We're going to see a collapse in the average American's ability to be able to own a home.
If you're homeless, just buy a house.
That's the crisis that we're facing right now, and it's tied directly to everything I explained about what happened back in 2008. You see, in the mid-2000s, this red-hot real estate market caused builders to build much larger homes than they normally would, because all of the buyers that were purchasing homes with no income, no assets, no job, they were buying as big of houses as they could because they weren't buying homes that they were going to live in. It was all just this flipping mentality where if I buy $1 million home now and prices continue to go up the way that they have been, well, let's see, like that is a couple percentage points a year. If I sell it in 3 years, I can sell it for 1.3 million. I can buy this home that I can't afford and I'm just going to sell it later and I'm going to make 300 grand. And that was everybody's plan. But in order to do that, you had to have these $1 million homes to flip later. So all the builders weren't focused on small single-family homes. They were focused on big houses to meet the demand for borrowers and buyers who were buying way more home than they could afford. And when all of that stopped, home builders not only went under, but the ones that survived also stopped building, which created a massive housing shortage in the United States. Because as demographics continued to expand for people who were first-time home buyers, new homes coming onto the market, being built, just wasn't happening because home builders were not building. They suddenly became super risk averse and really careful with what projects they were going to take. They focused on survival rather than feasting in a red-hot real estate market. But quietly, the real estate market has started to come back, but the home building hasn't. Builders never caught back up, which has led to the crisis that we're facing now. Because we now have a perfect storm in the opposite direction that we saw in 2008, where home prices are going to increase as fast as they dropped back then. Home ownership is no longer going to be the norm in the United States, and it all ties back to the fact that home builders stopped building after the crash in 2008. We've been left with a massive shortage in availability, and now we have a massive shortage in affordability because of the money printing that the Federal Reserve has been engaged in over the last 10 to 12 years. Because what's happened is when millennials hit the scene wanting to buy their first homes before and during the pandemic, there weren't any because builders haven't been building them. Currently, in the United States, there's a shortage of roughly 5.24 million homes. So demand is going to continue to be red hot in a market where the supply just isn't there. And to add fuel to this fire, the Fed's low interest rate policy, it's made borrowing money in large quantities more financially responsible. You actually want to borrow money because so much money is being printed that the value of a dollar has been decreasing substantially over time. So owning real estate is a great way to lock in a physical asset and put your money to work, because not only do you own a physical asset, in many cases, those assets are cash flow generating through rents and leases. So more printed money is driving more investors into an already red hot real estate market. And there's something even bigger behind all of this. Remember we talked about how the Fed lowered interest rates? They lowered interest rates by printing money to purchase mortgage-backed securities to stabilize the entire financial situation that was caused in 2008. Remember that? Obviously, more money printed would mean some sort of inflation, which it makes sense that investors are going into real estate to hedge against losing value in the money that they would otherwise save. But things get even worse because during the pandemic, the government issued the COVID relief packages, which resulted in anywhere between 40% and 80% of all dollars in existence to have been printed in the last 22 months. Which means a huge tidal wave of cash going back into the system, which means, you guessed it, more inflation, which means if your money is sitting in the bank, if you've got it saved under a mattress, it's losing purchasing power, which has forced investors to put their money into places where it might be somewhat protected or even chase a yield, which is why we're seeing such high prices in the stock market, in cryptocurrency, in artwork, in cars, and in real estate. All of these factors have come together to create the perfect storm of skyrocketing home prices. Lower interest rates means higher home prices. Lack of supply and increasing demand from millennials who want to buy their first home, higher home prices. Increased money supply, more dollars chasing a fixed number of assets, higher home prices. And builders basically sitting on their hands for the last 10 years has led to higher home prices. And unfortunately for the people who have been waiting on the sidelines, waiting for a collapse in prices, they're looking at things through the wrong lens. They're not recognizing that collapse is happening now, but not a collapse of home prices. It's a collapse in affordability that's tied directly back to what happened in 2008. If you look at the correlation between the two, the cause and effect, what's happening now makes a lot of sense, and it probably isn't going to change anytime soon. And with a continued exodus of residents out of failed states like California, Washington, Oregon, New York, fleeing violence and political policy and affordability issues, coupled with inflation, low interest rates, lack of supply in many housing markets across the nation, all at the same time, 2022 is likely going to be the year where the crisis ramps up to unsustainable levels. Not unsustainable levels in the price of housing, but unsustainable levels for first-time buyers to even get into the market. And for the people who have been waiting on the sidelines for a crash in home prices, they're likely going to be waiting for a very, very long time. It's a crazy thing to be witnessing because this type of collapse, a collapse of affordability, for middle-class Americans is one that it's steamrolling the same group of people who got hurt in 2008. People lost their homes in 2008, all of their wealth, all of their savings. And in 2022, those same people who have scraped together enough to get back in the game, even just to own their first home, they suddenly can't.